Purpose-Driven Progress. As always, my name is Jacob Hicks, and today I've got a question for you. Have you ever felt like a fraud? Have you ever felt like a fraud even when everybody else around you is telling you that you are just crushing it? You're just doing fantastic things. Today we're talking all about imposter syndrome and why it might just mean that you're on the edge of greatness. So let's get into it. First, I want to tell you guys about Maya Angelou. Now, super famous author, right? She wrote, tons and tons of books. She did incredible things, won tons of awards. Arguably one of the most celebrated writers of the 20th century. Did dozens of books, a few Grammys, won the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is no small feat. Now, for me, for somebody who's written just so much, I like to always think about their office. Like, what does their workspace look like? I feel like it's always probably a little bit different than mine. I always kind of see her like sitting at her desk. She has just stacks of manuscripts of what she's written on the desk next to her. She literally has her achievements, her worldly achievements, sitting right there in front of her. She maybe she wrote everything out by hand, which I'm sure a lot of folks did back then. So you hear the scratch of her pen on paper. And she picks one of her books and starts to leaf through it. And it has that, maybe that new book smell. For any of my reading fans out there, so I know you guys know what I'm talking about. I love that new book smell. And just think of how bittersweet must it have been to be such a prolific author, to have so much going for you, to have so many people telling you just how great you are and how great you are doing, but to still struggle with that inner critic. Even somebody like Maya Angelou struggled with imposter syndrome. Now, the interesting thing when I was researching for this episode, and just how common imposter syndrome is, I felt like a lot of people had dealt with it, but it was surprising to me that I saw that somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 to 80% of people have struggled with imposter syndrome. That means upwards of 4 out of every 5 people have struggled with it. I have. Maybe you have too. Now, the interesting thing about imposter syndrome is on the far end of the spectrum with it is that it can truly become a self-fulfilling prophecy, meaning that your self-doubt is so high that it inevitably leads to fulfilling itself. It can lead to isolation too. So here's some things that you can do to help you deal with imposter syndrome. First, acknowledge it and discuss your feelings. Now, this doesn't mean that you need to go out and tell everybody and their dog just how you're feeling. Like, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm just a fraud and I'm just so full of it. Like, I'm just never going to really amount to much. And these people don't really know what I'm going through. It doesn't mean tell everybody everything. But I would strongly suggest finding that maybe 1 or 2 people in your life, your true confidants, and tell them how you're feeling. It's like, hey man, I'm really struggling with this right now. To recognize that imposter feeling. It's common. And share your experiences with peers or maybe some mentors. It can really alleviate your feelings of isolation. Second, reframe your negative thoughts. So challenge self-doubt by focusing on evidence of past achievements and positive feedback. This is one of my favorite strategies from, if you're familiar with David Goggins, he's a former Navy SEAL and has run a bunch of ultramarathons and done some like really, really crazy, really out there physical activity. Like for a while there, he had, or maybe still does have, the pull-up world record, 4,500 some odd pull-ups they did in 24 hours. So crazy stuff like that. He calls this strategy going into the cookie jar. So finding those achievements that you have in your life and revisiting those experiences and revisiting those feelings can really help you get through some of these things. Third, celebrate the successes. Now, this doesn't mean that, oh man, I went out and I got my PhD and now I'm going to be on this big research project and all this stuff, blah, blah, blah. That can absolutely be part of it. But I don't know about you guys, but I am not going out and getting PhDs all day, every day. So celebrate the small wins too. It's like, hey, today, this morning, I was really struggling to get out of bed and I got out of bed and I cleaned my apartment. That can be your win. Find those small wins and let those things build up and build momentum. So the fourth one is seek support. So engage in therapy or counseling if it makes sense for you. I'm a big believer in therapy. Not for everybody, not for always, but it can be really, really nice to have that true professional to help you get through some of these struggling times. And the fifth is probably, I think, the strongest in my opinion, is developing that self-compassion. I don't know about you guys, but sometimes I can be really good at giving other people grace. It's like, oh, maybe they're going through a bad day or, blah, blah, blah. And that's why they, said these things to me that I didn't particularly care for. I can do that, but I rarely extend that grace to myself. I can really struggle with that, saying, hey man, you didn't get everything done that you wanted to get done today, but you did get up and you did give it your best effort. The way that I like to think about it is in terms of percentages, where it's like we have to give 110% all the day, every time, blah, blah, blah. And true that you can't have those really, really strong days where you wake up and you give it just your 100% effort. Well, what about those days where maybe you don't have 100% to give? Maybe you're feeling like a 40% day or a 60% day, and that's all you really have to give. The thing with that is if you only have 40% to give on a particular day and you give 40%, then that means you gave 100% because that's all you had left in your cup for that day. You gave everything that you could. So develop that self-compassion, be kind to yourself, and really let go of perfection as much as you possibly can. So mistakes are going to be part of growth. So one of the first real times that I felt imposter syndrome, it was after a speaking event. And I thought it went, decently well. Nothing crazy, but I thought it went pretty well. Folks seemed to be resonating with what I was saying to them. And after I got done speaking, I had folks come up and tell me just how amazing I had been doing. So it's so weird, like when you're in moments like that, like the details just stick out in your mind. And I remember I was in a beige room, and that really sticks out to me. Like I was in this just tannish room, and I had my slides up behind me. I had my participants guide all handed out to everybody. You could hear, people with their pen scratching, filling out, the blanks that I'd given them. And people kept telling me just how amazing I was doing. Like, Jacob, you're just doing great things. Like, I can't wait for your growth. Like, it's just fantastic. And those are good things to hear. But I felt like a fraud in that moment. It's like, I guess I am doing okay, but it really just didn't feel like I was on top of the world or anything. I feel like I was just in my daily grind. Like it wasn't anything to write home about. It wasn't anything special, but people just kept telling me that. I just remember thinking, like, if only they knew. Have you guys ever felt like that? Like, if only they really knew what was going on. So I was feeling like that, and I reached out to a really good friend of mine, and I was telling him this story, and there was a pause after I got done telling him what had happened and what was, what I was feeling. And he said, yeah, Jacob, people are telling you those things because they're true. They were true. But I was doing, again, nothing wild. I'm not going on, the morning show or anything like that, but I was having an impact. I was helping people, which is ultimately my purpose, ultimately what I want to be doing. So what they were telling me was true. So sometimes we just need to get out of our head. I always think of it like that old saying, you can't see the forest for the trees. Like I'm so busy like in the forest counting the trees or whatever it is that I'm doing that I can't take that step back to really gain the proper perspective that I need. My buddy really helped me with that. Now, one thing I want to make sure to mention to you guys is that imposter syndrome doesn't mean that you're failing. It can often mean that you're growing. It can often mean that you are growing. You might be right where you need to be, so keep going. As always, thank you for listening. So if you know anyone that has been struggling with imposter syndrome, please feel free to share this with them, and don't forget to subscribe for more strategies. I'll see you guys next time.